It has been a busy few months in Washington, D.C. As Republicans rush to pass their sweeping tax bill, the deadline looms for Congress to fund the government. A senator stepped down over sexual misconduct allegations, while more lawmakers call on the president to resign.
There is some irony in the fact that I am leaving while a man who has bragged on tape about his history of sexual assault sits in the Oval Office.
And Democrat Doug Jones pulled off an upset win in the Alabama special election for the Senate, bringing the Republican advantage over Democrats in the Senate to only 2.
We have shown the country the way that we can.
Oregon Representative Earl Blumenauer joins us to talk about the latest on Capitol Hill and what we might see in the new year. From KGW News, this is Straight Talk with Laurel Porter.
Hello, and thank you for joining us for Straight Talk. I'm Laurel Porter. A lot of us are in the holiday season mode, but in Washington, D.C., it is a critical time for Congress. Lawmakers have until Friday, December 22nd, to pass a funding bill to keep the government running. And Republicans are trying to pass their sweeping tax overhaul bill by Christmas. A final vote is expected next week. Oregon Congressman Earl Blumenauer has a front row seat and an important role as a senior member of the House Ways and Means Committee. He's here to give us some insight into what's happening on Capitol Hill. Welcome to my guest, Oregon 3rd District Congressman Earl Blumenauer. Congressman, thank you for joining us here on Straight Talk again.
My pleasure.
So much to talk about, but let's start with the passing of a political icon in Oregon. Former Mayor Veera Katz died at the age of 84 earlier this week. You knew her well. You worked with her in the Oregon legislature. You had a spirited battle against her for mayor, which she won. What will you remember most about Veera Katz?
Well, I was just down actually at City Hall inscribing the memory book there for her. Thinking about really a third of a century that we worked together were fascinating times in Oregon's history for the state. It was fascinating in terms of the role that she carved out as a very strong, pioneering woman leader. And then her tenure at the city coincided with some really remarkable things. She was focused, she was determined, she was passionate. And Oregon and Portland are better for her service.
I can tell this is really emotional for you. You've joked in the past, though, that her winning that mayor's race was the best thing that ever happened to you.
It was terrific. It was good for both of us. I would not be doing the things that I'm doing now had I won that race. And I feel privileged to move in that direction. And it was, we did joke about that. That was good for both of us.
Well, let's talk about what you're doing now in Congress. So much happening. And as we speak, Friday afternoon, details of the Republican tax bill are just coming out. What do you think of this bill from what you know about what's in it?
Well, it is not as bad as it was. I mean, the things that we argued against, what the Republicans put in it in the House, in terms of stripping away student interest loans, having an Alzheimer's tax on people with very high medical bills that were all middle-income people that were just going to be hammered, almost 9 million of them. We, I think, got our points across and they retreated. But the simple fact is that it still represents the largest transfer of wealth in our nation's history to people who don't much need it, the largest corporations, the richest people who will get the overwhelming lion's share of this, and it will be financed on the backs of our children, your new granddaughter, with a massive increase in debt while we're ignoring real issues that we can't fund now, like the opioid crisis or our infrastructure. It's really, I think, a very tragic turn. Every week, people are going to learn more that was stuffed into it. Special interest provisions that some lobbyist or some senator got sort of out of the spotlight. But it will become clear what it is, and every week people will find more reasons why a majority of Americans oppose it.
Some of the things that people heard about that they were worried about, especially in Oregon, which is a high income tax state, they thought that people wouldn't be able to deduct their state income tax any longer from their federal tax burden. That has now been preserved, from what we know, in this new bill, up to $10,000.
Yeah, actually it's not, because what they're, as I understand it, and this is ironic because there hasn't been anything officially released. We're operating off information that the lobbyists have. I mean, think about that.
You haven't actually seen the bill.
I'm getting reports from the lobby. But it appears as though what they've done is that they've given more flexibility between writing off income tax or property tax. But in a state like Oregon, which doesn't have a sales tax, so we all have high property tax bills and high income tax bills. This is going to hammer many middle and upper middle income people in Oregon. It's going to make it harder to finance what we need, and it penalizes us with a tax on a tax that is going to be wildly unpopular. Oregon in particular is going to have a difficult time recruiting higher income people, the people at Intel, at Nike. I mean, some of the leading industries here have many well-paid professionals that pay a lot of income tax and property tax, and people are going to look at it and they're going to say, I don't think we can afford to move here. I just heard from one executive this morning who was saying this is going to be devastating for their company.
Republican Senator Corker had been a holdout. He was going to vote no. He's now, as of Friday, flipped, saying he sees it as a once-in-a-generation opportunity to help American businesses be more productive domestically and competitive internationally. Is that a good part of this bill?
No. I mean, as a practical matter, it's not doing anything to make us more competitive internationally. It does provide some incentives to locate more operations overseas. It's going to, right now, corporations have access to money that they have. They're very competitive, they're profitable, but this is not going to result in increased investment in the United States. It's very clear, and business leaders have been quite candid. If they get extra money, they're going to buy back their shares, which boosts the share prices and their compensation. They're going to increase dividends. They're going to buy down their debt. You remember that was a famous session on Capitol Hill where one of the president's key advisors was asking how many people who were business leaders in the audience were going to invest their tax savings in productivity and hiring. And virtually nobody raised their hand. And you say, well, why aren't more hands up? Well, because that's not their priorities. Buy their stock, increase dividends, buy down debt, and the trickle down is going to be very little.
And this tax bill eliminates the individual mandate from Obamacare, so people won't have to buy health insurance. They would face a fine in the past. What does that do to the health insurance market?
Well, it's another step. This administration and my Republican friends have been working to destabilize the health insurance market. And the industry is quite clear. That's why many of these rates have been going up, because people they can't depend on the law being fairly implemented. Now this is, according to, again, the independent scorekeepers, means in 10 years there will be 13 million more Americans who won't have health insurance. And starting next year, average premiums are going to go up 10% or more every year. This is ludicrous. These are the things that people rose up arguing against earlier in the year when it shot down their efforts to repeal the Affordable Care Act, but they've snuck in a piece here that's going to have a really destabilizing effect on the health insurance industry and coverage for Americans.
You'll be voting on Tuesday. Is there anything that could convince you to vote for the tax bill?
Yes, if it were not financed on the backs of our children and grandchildren, and make it revenue neutral. That's the last Republican plan that was introduced, and that's what Paul Ryan and Mitt Romney claimed they were going to do to get rid of tax deductions. And of course, Trump talked about that during the campaign, but that's been lost. $1.5 trillion, and when you throw in the interest that's going to be paid on that, it's $2.3 trillion.
Over the top of $20 trillion debt
that we've got right now, and is going up. For the last 3 years, it's gone up and up and up. It's $688 billion so far this year, and we haven't finished the disaster relief, and they've got a plan to boost more military spending. So I wouldn't finance it on the backs of our children, and I would be investing things like infrastructure and helping more directly lower middle income Americans who get a tiny sliver of this, and the relief that they are promised is temporary. It all goes away in 10 years. The richest and most powerful have permanent tax relief. Middle America is going to start seeing increases in 2 years, and it's going to continue over the course of 10 years. That's not something my constituents want me to vote for, and it's why it's so unpopular with the public overall.
On top of that, if that wasn't enough, you have the funding bill, and the government, that runs out. You had a continuing resolution for 2 weeks. That runs out next Friday. Is there a risk we're going to see the government shut down?
Well, that depends on whether or not the Republicans who are in charge can either put together a plan that they themselves support. Right now, they're bitterly divided. Some want to increase military spending. Some want to go after some of the domestic spending. They are in disarray, but they don't want to work with Democrats. If they would work with us on priorities that are supported by the American people, being able to have a balanced funding program, being able to deal with critical issues like what we're going to do with almost 700,000 undocumented young people who are here that are going to start being deported at the rate of 1,000 a day.
And that's something the Democrats want in this funding bill, some protections for dreamers.
Well, this is something that is going to have a devastating effect, not just on almost 700,000 young people, but on their families and their employers. The business community doesn't want this. The American people don't want this. And we think it's reasonable to not put it off.
And the president, if for any immigration package, if you talk about dreamers, he wants funding for the wall. Is he going to get that?
I can't foresee that happening. The Republicans could pass it tomorrow if they were in agreement, but they aren't in agreement themselves that it's the right path forward. I don't see where his intransigence on the wall helps move things forward. But this guy changes his mind in a heartbeat. You know, he was against Roy Moore, and then he goes all in for Roy Moore, and now he claims after Roy Moore lost that it was somebody else's fault and he didn't think it was a good idea all along. He has no consistency, and we don't know what he's going to do next. That's why Congress should roll up its sleeves, do it on its own, and why the Republicans should either get their act together or work with us.
One of the things you were able to get in that continuing resolution was protections for medical marijuana users in states where it's legal, but that also expires on Friday the 22nd. Will you be able to get that into any new funding bill?
Well, we've been successful over the course of the last 4 years to be able to get a majority support in both the House and the Senate. There is actually more support in this Congress if the leadership would allow it to be voted on, but it's in the Senate bill. A majority in the House support it. I think we're going to end up being able to, if it is just another continuing resolution, we'll be able, I'm convinced, to be able to protect it. And if we do have a long-term funding bill, I think the odds are very strong that it'll be taken care of. But here again, this is where the overwhelming majority of the American public supports medical marijuana and non-federal intervention. And it would seem to be a no-brainer, but my friends are advancing all sorts of things that the public doesn't want, from their tax bill to getting rid of net neutrality.
Well, let's talk about net neutrality.
Okay.
That is dead. The FCC rolled that back on Thursday, and that means that people say the internet service providers could favor their own services. Since it's dead, will Oregonians possibly see their internet bills go up now?
Well, we don't know how fast things will happen, but it's interesting, 73% of Republicans oppose this decision to scrap net neutrality. when we have greater and greater concentration of the media, I mean, your business looks a lot different than it did 5 or 10, let alone 20 years ago. And it's definitely a threat. People know it. That's why they're deeply concerned. And we watch what's happened with some of the large media operations. I think people are right to be nervous and be prepared for the worst.
You mentioned the race in Alabama with Roy Moore and Doug Jones. Doug Jones, the Democrat, defeating Roy Moore by a narrow margin. Of course, Moore had been accused of sexually assaulting young girls in his 30s. What was your reaction when Doug Jones was able to win that race?
Well, I was obviously pleased. I mean, it marked a low part in American politics when a major political party and the President of the United States was willing to support somebody with very powerful evidence that he was involved with being a pedophile and being banned from a mall. And somehow the fact that he was just a Republican merited support. I mean, does that mean they would support an axe murderer if he would vote for the president's tax program? And many Republicans, including the president's daughter, thought that this was credible and disturbing. I was pleased that Alabama showed that there are a number of people that will look at the facts and vote in terms of what is decent, not necessarily political. And it was amazing what's happened with women. We've watched this across the country. The fantastic results for Democrats in Virginia were driven by women voters and women candidates. And I think that's going to be the hallmark of what happens next year politically. This is truly going to be the year of the woman.
Jones' victory does come amongst what's being called a societal or cultural reckoning in the Me Too sexual harassment movement. And now there's a call by some Democrats for a congressional investigation into Donald Trump's history of sexual misconduct allegations. 3 women who accused the president before the election have renewed their push to gain attention for their accusations. What do you think should happen? Should there be a congressional investigation?
I think it's worthy of investigation. Absolutely. It's not just 1 or 2. There are, like, I think 19. We have on tape the president's own voice bragging about molesting women. And it upset most of the Republican candidates back in the campaign when this tape came out. And now people sort of have a collective shrug. Well, I don't think the country is collectively shrugging. There are, in fact, efforts to hold people accountable. This is going on in Congress, in business, in the media. I think it's important and overdue. And just because somebody is President of the United States doesn't mean they should be exempt from scrutiny as well.
The White House says the president has previously denied any improprieties, and the American people voiced their judgment, delivering Donald Trump a decisive victory. His supporters also point out that these accusations relate to alleged incidents before he took office. Should that be a distinction? Should that make a difference?
Well, I mean, most of what happened with Al Franken leaving office occurred before he was a United States Senator, and they were not as egregious as things that Donald Trump bragged about in his own voice. So I think this is appropriate to be focused on. The longer the Republican Party stonewalls on this, I don't think it's good for them. How they were temporizing with Roy Moore, who's not going away. He's still, refusing to concede. It's not good for the Republican Party. It's not good for America. I have been stunned in the course of the recent weeks to have stories come out about people I know. I just met Russell Simmons a few weeks ago. And having this avalanche come forward is very jarring to me. I'm watching members of Congress resigning. I'm watching this deep-seated frustration on the part of so many women who are talking about how this has not been appropriately addressed and the lingering consequences that it's had. And I think it is probably a healthy thing we're going through. I think it's important, and we ought to, I think, deal with it squarely.
Congressman, thank you. I know there's another item that you're very concerned about and really interested in is the Farm Bill. You've been working on it for years, and it's something important to all of us who eat. And we're going to talk about that right after the break. We'll be back in 2 minutes.